Uh, it's great to be back in Turkey, if only visually, virtually, and to see so many familiar faces in the Zoom audience. I hope to see many of you in person in the coming years. Well, my topic today is the architecture of the Caucasus in the global Middle Ages, an approach I've attempted to take in my recent book, Eastern Medieval Architecture. But let me begin by identifying a few terms. First, the Caucasus. As a political or cultural sphere is a bit more complicated than just Eastern medieval or architecture as terms. The region is an important historical crossroads, now divided between countries with less than friendly borders, framed by Russia to the north and Turkey and Iran to the south. Not surprisingly, national boundaries can become psychological barriers, particularly in scholarship. Today, I'll focus on monuments we identify with medieval Georgia and Armenia, now spread across those present-day countries, as well as northeastern Turkey. Second, scholarship in medieval studies has taken what has been called a global turn in the last decades. Traditionally, medieval studies have focused almost exclusively on Western Europe, and the global turn attempts to decenter this approach and expand our view, asking, for example, what do we gain by adding the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Mediterranean, or the Balkans, or Russia, or the Indian Ocean, or China, or even sub-Saharan Africa to our discussions of political interaction, economic networks, and cultural exchange. Now, rather than insisting on us becoming generalists to learn everything about everywhere, this approach works best in a combination of macro and micro views. That is, a careful analysis of regional contexts, which are often studied in isolation, with an attempt to place them into a larger cultural or geopolitical framework. So for the purposes of today's lecture, we begin with a look at three important periods of creativity and innovation in the monuments of medieval Georgia and Armenia. And while highlighting specific monuments and historical moments, we'll attempt to situate them within a broader context. Now, I should note up front that I am neither Georgian nor Armenian, so I'm really an informed non-specialist here, although I have to say I'm pleased to see in the audience several of my Georgian and Armenian friends from whom I have learned a great deal about the architecture. So let me begin with a look at the 7th century. Can we mute these, mute your microphone if you are listening in. I don't want to listen to you while I'm speaking. Thank you. Let me begin with a look at the 7th century, for which I'll focus on the Church of the Holy Cross at Hibari, which rises prominently on a hill above the medieval Georgian city of Mshketa. Some background is in order here. We're talking about a period in which Western Europe and the Byzantine Empire were descending into the Dark Ages. Now, nevertheless, faced with similar political difficulties, there's hardly a Dark Age in the Caucasus, at least during the 7th century. A frontier zone between warring Byzantines and Persians, and subsequently Byzantines and Arabs, the architecture of the region is distinctive both for its quality and its abundance. The remarkable flourishing of architecture in the Caucasus is unparalleled in contemporary Byzantium, with finely constructed stone buildings and the introduction of a variety of new and innovative building forms. Although structural systems differ in detail, the dome emerges as a central design feature in Caucasian church architecture, as it had in Byzantium. And several vaulted basilicas in both Armenia and Georgia incorporated fully developed cross-domed units and spatial organizations similar to those of Byzantium proper. Well, there's a heightened awareness of events outside the region. What is most distinctive is the coalescing of local architectural forms. There were, of course, some opportunities for transmission of architectural ideas, such as Armenian elites visiting Constantinople or imperial military campaigns in the region. But it may be best to view the architectural production of the 7th century Caucasus as a parallel development to what we know from elsewhere in Byzantium. Well, architectural forms are remarkably similar. Armenia and Georgia were distinctive both linguistically and ecclesiastically. Armenian is an Indo-European language, somewhat similar to Persian, while Georgian is unique, unrelated to any other linguistic group. Each has its own alphabet. Armenia is said to be the first state to adopt Christianity. The date of 303 is often given, and although Miaphysite, it maintained its own ecclesiastical hierarchy and patriarch. In contrast, Georgia remained Chalcedonian, recognizing the religious authority of Constantinople. Nevertheless, the borders between Armenia and Georgia were fluid and permeable, and the architectural developments are best discussed together. Now, this is no easy task in light of the history and historiography of the region. Modern political boundaries do not reflect historical ones, with scholarship often nationally focused, while the standing monuments are spread across several modern states with less than friendly borders. Indeed, it may be impossible to draw a historical map of the medieval Caucasus on which all current stakeholders would agree. The historical nucleus of both Armenia and Georgia extends into what is now Eastern Turkey, and it once included areas now within Azerbaijan and under Russian control. In addition to the Armenian and Georgian languages, much of the scholarship on the architecture has been in Russian, a linguistic triple whammy able to put off all but the most stalwart of Western scholars. Nevertheless, the remarkable inventiveness of the Caucasian builders deserves special attention, with new elements introduced into plans, vaulting, and surface articulation. Now, Roman heritage may be a critical element to understanding the architecture of the region. And while few Roman monuments survive today, the restored temple at Gaianae is a notable exception. A strong Roman presence is documented. For most of our examples, the wall construction is of a finely cut ashlar facing on a mortared rubble core, following the Roman model, as you see in this Armenian example here. And this distinguishes it from the pure ashlar construction or pure cut stone construction of Syria, with which it is often compared. Early churches also retained distinctive temple-like features. The 5th century basilica at Arayoik, for example, rises above a stepped base, originally with lateral porticos, and while fully standing from a distance, its profile might have been confused with that of a temple. Barrel vaults and banded barrel vaults also follow the Roman tradition, as the 5th century Sioni Basilica at Bolnisi in Georgia, or the Kazakh Basilica at Oparan in Armenia demonstrate. And there are a variety of other examples. And you see here, they have cruciform piers that reflect the structural division of the interior. Domes are normally rise above squinches in a transitional zone. However, here following the Persian model, um, but pendentives occasionally appear more commonly in Armenia than in Georgia, at least in the early churches. And in striking contrast to contemporary Byzantine churches, Caucasian monuments are exceptionally well documented, with public inscriptions on their exteriors. Cross-dome basilica may be the best term to categorize many of the Caucasian churches. In Georgia, the Church of the Ascension at Zromi, built around 626 to 635, has a cross-domed unit at its core, the dome braced by barrel vaults on four sides, and the dome, now reconstructed, rises above four compound piers with squinches in the transition. The plan included a narthex with flanking chambers and a gallery that extends above the narthex and the western corner bays. On the east facade, the planar surface is broken by two tall V-shaped recesses that flank the apse, distinctive features that we find in both Armenian and Georgian churches. Within the Armenian sphere, the cathedral at Rennes, completed before around 640, is remarkable for its scale and tall proportions. Its centrally positioned dome, rising above four compound piers, and it's braced by barrel vaults on all four sides. As is common in Armenia, there is no narthex, with portals on the west, north, and south facades, and the sanctuary flanked by chapels. The dome rises above trumpet squinches and a tall drum, emphasizing the height of the interior. The architecture is austere, with planar surfaces and prismatic. Please set your volume to mute. Thank you. The architecture is austere, with planar surfaces and prismatic volumes. The Church of St. Gaianae at Ousterhout is similar, although smaller, commemorating the martyrdom of an early Armenian saint and companion to the more famous Ripsime, the church constructed around 630. In contrast, the church at Aruch, dated to the 660s, maintains an elongated basilican character with a dome at its center, supported above pendentives and piers engaged to the lateral walls with a remarkably unified interior. The large church at Tallinn must be roughly similar in date, with an elongated interior and the dome rising above pendentives. But it's considerably more complex in form and detailing, with lateral aisles flanking the nave, and in addition to the eastern apse being expressed on the exterior, there are lateral apses as well, a type of plan that we see in later Georgian churches. These, as well as the dome drum, are faceted on the exterior and articulated with engaged coupled colonnettes. Now, the contrast between the stark simplicity of Mren or Zromi and the elaborations evident at Tallinn indicate the variety possible in the 7th century Caucasus. Let me now turn to the Church of the Holy Cross at Hibari, which introduces a remarkably different architectural design. The development of the domed octagon church type may have had its first appearance here, a remarkably innovative design that proved popular across the Caucasus and beyond. The centralized nave is extended by apses on four sides with small niches at the corners opening into subsidiary spaces. Squinches at the corners support an octagonal drum with sets of smaller squinches transitioning to a hemispherical dome. Small windows appear in four facets of the drum, which appears as a tall octagon on the exterior. The four apses project on the exterior, joined to the corner compartments by blind arches, with figural sculpture enlivening many of the facades. Throughout, there's an experimental quality to the building, with details not fully resolved. For example, the squinches spring from the haunches of the arches and do not relate visually or structurally to the 8 piers below. And there's no cornice to mark the transition to the dome. Now, built on the site where traditionally St. Nino, the apostle of Georgia, is credited with the conversion of King Mirian III of Iberia to Christianity by erecting a huge miraculous cross on the site of a pagan temple. Inscriptions mention the builders and their titles, including Stephanos, the first prince of Iberia, who holds the title of Patricios, along with Demetrius and Ardanaze, who both hold the title of Hippatos. Now, one wonders if the unusual design of the church could reflect current events, as Stephanos reversed the politics of his father and sided with the Persians against the Byzantines, even briefly turning away from Constantinople and Chalcedonian Christianity. The return to orthodoxy in 608 resulted in the rupture between the Armenian and Georgian churches. The Byzantine army, led by the Emperor Heraclius, emerged victorious in this period, however, and had Stephanos flayed alive in 627, with the Georgian church remaining in the Orthodox fold. Whatever its origins and political implications, the new forms seen at Hibari found rapid popularity across Georgia and Armenia. The Sioni Basilica at Ateni in Georgia is quite similar to Hibari, although probably slightly later in date. The Church of St. Ripsime at Bagarshapot in Armenia, dated 618 to 30, is similar in many ways, although characteristic of Armenian churches, less sculptural on the exterior, and brought out to square. The proportion or the positions of the apses is marked only by V-shaped indentations, with a gable rising above the midsection of each facade. The four facades are virtually identical, differentiated only by the addition of a late medieval belfry on the west side. The dome rises above a polygonal drum with a conical cap. The interior regularizes many of the awkward features at Hibari. Squinches rise directly from the piers, and the transition to drum is marked by a cornice. The drum is pierced by 12 windows, organized in sets of 3, and the interior of the dome is articulated by roundels and by a radiating cross composed of 12 rays aligned with the windows. So how do we account for the innovative plan of Hibari and related buildings? First, although there may be Persian precedents for the use of squinches to make the transition to dome, there are no good examples of the centralized plan. Those in Persian architecture tend to be square or cruciform. Second, is there a special meaning associated with the centralized plan? The idea of a centralized martyrium or martyr shrine is often noted by scholars as many of the churches in this group were commemorative, honoring sacred locations or figures critical to early Caucasian Christianity. At the same time, however, many contemporary commemorative structures were basilican in design. So many, in fact, that it's difficult to make a distinction based solely on function. Why, for example, was Hripsime honored with a centrally planned church, while her companion martyr, Gaianae, was commemorated at about the same time with a basilica? So in the final analysis, the choice of architectural design may have been as much a formal decision as anything else. That is, evidence of the creativity and love of variety that characterizes the Caucasian building tradition throughout its rich history. Now, this inventiveness and love of variety is evident in later centuries as well, notably in the dramatic architectural revival of the 10th and 11th centuries. For this period, I'll focus on the Georgian church of St. John the Baptist at Oshvank or Oshki, the grandest of the 10th century churches built by David the Great and his brother Bagrat. The dome basilica follows a plan seen in the 7th century at Tallinn, although much elaborated, and the remarkable variety in its decorative details and vaulting forms is virtually unprecedented. Well, after a period of minimal architectural activity, both Armenia and Georgia experienced a flourishing construction in the 10th and 11th centuries, notably churches with finely carved ashlar construction and sculptural ornament, distinct from their contemporary Byzantine counterparts. Indeed, much seems to follow directly upon the regional construction techniques and building types established in the 7th century, although almost as if the intervening 3 centuries didn't exist. The elegance of the architecture of the 10th and 11th century reveals little of the complex political situation in the Caucasus. The entire area was under Arab domination during much of the Dark Ages or transitional period, but by the 9th century, both Armenia and Georgia became increasingly independent. Both were ruled as Arab protectorates by members of the Armenian Bagratid family, initially as princes, but by the 880s as kings. The elevation of their titles corresponds with the weakening of Arab control in the region, which allowed both the Georgians and Armenians to become relatively powerful and prosperous in the 10th century. But the region remained a series of small, semi-independent, and often feuding Christian polities, set between the expanding power of Byzantium to the east and the emerging threat of the Seljuks, or Byzantium to the west, and the emerging threat of the Seljuks to the east, with borders and political alliances remaining fluid. The church architecture of Armenia and Georgia remained remarkably similar throughout the early period, indicative of the close religious ties of the area during that time. Both the architectural developments and religious ties of the 10th century and later are more distinctive, reflecting the remarkable individuality of parallel cultures. Although construction techniques and decorative features are often similar, the Georgians preferred the basilica, whether domed or not, to the more centralized design of the Armenians, as evident here at Octamar, or the Armenian capital of Ani. Now, architecture flourished from the mid-century onwards, beginning in the western Georgian regions of the Tau Klarjeti, now in northeastern Turkey, associated with the rule of David III of Tau. Churches were often isolated in the rugged landscape, doubling as monasteries, cathedrals, burial places, and administrative centers. More than anything, however, they stand as monuments to their patrons, for in a land with shifting allegiances and frontiers, churches proved to be the most durable monuments, as their survival testifies. Let me begin with Octagon, or Dirt Kilise, now in eastern Turkey, a grand three-aisled basilica reviving a type known in the early period. Built in the time of David the Great, the church the name means the Church of the Four, meaning the four holy men, as opposed to four churches, as its name might suggest. A splendid monastery is mentioned on the site in a text of 965, so the church may have been built shortly before this. In the apse, an unnamed female appears holding a model of the church. And while lacking a dome, Octa Ecclesia is nevertheless impressive in its monumental austerity and magnificent, pristine setting. As with the Armenian churches just discussed, the construction is of ashlar on a rubble core, with the superstructure resting on a stepped base. The church itself is three-aisled, with the nave and side aisles covered by banded barrel vaults. The lofty central nave rising to include thin, clerestory windows, in addition to two zones of smaller windows in the side aisles. The exterior is articulated by blind arcades, which step up gracefully on the east and west facades, with an emphasis on linearity and vertical attenuation. The Romanesque-like orderliness suggested by the architectonic detailing is, however, misleading. The bays of the nave are of different dimensions. The arcading of the exterior walls bears no relationship to the internal structural system. Even the banding of the barrel vaults doesn't always match from the nave to the side aisles. As in other Caucasian examples of this period, architectonic features are used as an aesthetic solution rather than as a visual expression of structure. Joints in the ashlar of the upper east and west facades indicate a change in the design, either during construction or very shortly thereafter. The original roof level had a shallower pitch and was about 4 meters lower, that is, following the angle of the stepped arcades, probably without a clerestory. An inscription on the apex of the east gable mentions David as with the title Kuropalates, a title that he'd received in 978. So this modification must have occurred after 978 or before about 1001. Now, Octa Ecclesia is unusual in its vaulting, although the nearby monastic church of Parhala or Barhal is similarly barrel vaulted and includes all the design features of Octa Ecclesia, but here in a single phase of construction. It's unclear if Parhala might have influenced the increased elevation in the nave of Octa Ecclesia, or vice versa. Considerably more common for Georgian architecture, however, is the domed basilica. Of these, the Church of St. John the Baptist at Ousterhout is the grandest of the 10th century churches, built by David the Great and his brother Bagrat. The site served as both a monastery and administrative center, although virtually nothing of the secular buildings survives. And the monastery buildings are now in ruins. Lavishly decorated with exterior sculpture, images of the founders appear presenting the church at the southeast corner. On the exterior preserves abundant inscriptions, both carved and painted. You see in the black and white, this is the presentation image with the missing panel now in a regional museum put back in place. The plan of the church is equally complex, measuring about 40.6 by 27 meters internally, with a dome rising 30 meters above the floor. The cross arms of the dome basilica terminate in apses, and all three apses are framed by chapels. The single-aisled nave was covered by a banded barrel vault, now mostly fallen, composed of 5 bays of different lengths marked by stepped pilasters on the wall. The dome, with an internal diameter of close to 9 meters, rises on a tall drum broken by 12 large windows above 4 piers that define the crossing. Those to the east are cylindrical, that is, on the right of this photo. Those to the left are compound piers. The high arches are slightly pointed, with pendentas in the transition decorated with shell-like reliefs. And in addition to the rich architectural sculpture, traces of painted decorations survive throughout the interior, as well as decoration in red on the exterior. The south porch, with its oddly asymmetrical gabled roof, encloses a lengthy inscription in red paint that provides a wealth of details about the foundation, presented in the words of the master mason Grigol. And it tells not just about the founders, but enumerates the workers and materials involved in the project. For the architectural historian, this is a precious document, as you can see in the translation there. The painted decoration of the exterior also raises a few questions in my mind. Was the inscription meant to be carved? Elsewhere on the porch, for example, colonnettes appear unfinished, with a carved pattern in the lower portion continuing upward in painted red. In other places, the red paint is clearly an afterthought that separates the construction, separate from the construction or carving. As, for example, on the east facade, as you see here, where the bands of construction continue in horizontal courses, while sometime later, voussoirs, the radiating elements, have been painted in red. The south nave opens into a portico, a marvel of unusual vaulting forms and explosion of carved decoration, perhaps the best surviving evidence of the innovative approach of the Masons coupled with a love of decorative variety. Each of the piers is unique. Cylindrical, quatrefoil, octagonal, fluted, spiral. The vaults are similarly innovative, each unique and lavishly carved, octagonal above squinches, with a central cross framed by scalloped segments. The final octagonal column is uniquely decorated with angels, holy figures, and the shaft is covered with a pattern that resembles angels' wings. Externally, the decoration is similarly robust. Both figural decoration and sculpture is often asymmetrically disposed. Built more than a generation later, the cathedral at Ishan was inaugurated in its present form under Georgi I and completed under Bagrat IV by about 1032. It's similarly a monumental dome basilica, a finely constructed ashlar, resplendent with relief sculpture, and the Masons here similarly delighting in variety. The walls are heavily articulated with multiple setbacks. detailed with pilasters and colonnettes that continue into the arcades. The exuberant linearity of the architectural detailing is complemented by a rich painted program on the interior, partially preserved, with the exaltation of the cross dramatically set against a background of lapis lazuli in the dome. But the exuberant architectonic detailing bears only nominal relationship to the interior structural divisions. And oddly, the lateral facades and the dome are not aligned. The external arcading, even the window placement, does not reflect the internal structure. As with the slightly earlier Georgian churches, the decorated facades seems to have been the primary concern of the Masons, not any sort of structural logic for the arcading. For the 13th century, I focus on the development of the Gavit, or Zamatun, in Armenia, with a look at the monastery at Gegard. The Gavit was a multi-purpose space that could serve as a meeting hall, burial place, overflow from the church, or even the setting for services when the main church was not used. While the exterior of the Gavit remains relatively plain, the interior often displays a bravura array of vaulting forms. In all, variety seems the key concern, with forms such as the mukarnas, or honeycomb vault, that reflect the close interactions with the Seljuks of the period. And here, just for political context, I show my favorite incomprehensible map. Unlike Armenia, which experienced a revival in the 13th century with innovative new architectural forms, within Georgian territories, standardization seems to have been the rule, although with an increased verticality to forms. The 13th century Armenia saw a great deal of construction, although the church proper remained relatively conservative, usually domed and cruciformed, with corner compartments on 2 levels, the dome rising above pendentives, with the surfaces of the vaults unarticulated. The exteriors are similarly formulaic. Within monastic complexes, however, these were now surrounded by clusters of subsidiary buildings, loosely organized and distinct, the whole often fortified, as at the monastery of Hagpat in the mountainous north, or Gegard in a gorge near Gaianae. All grew around older foundations. Gegard is primarily from the 13th century at the site of an older cave hermitage and spring, expanded with both rock cut and masonry architecture. Some additions were small chapels, the result of private benefaction. But there are also belfries, refectories, and libraries at these monasteries. Most impressive and original of the 13th century additions is the monumental entry vestibule known as the Gavit, or Zamatun. Although this building type originates earlier, it proliferates in the 13th century. Hormos monastery is usually cited as the earliest example. Most commonly, they are 9-bayed with a central vault opening into an oculus window in the vault, with a bravura display of vaulting forms. In all, vaulting seems to be the key concern, with several different vaulting types employed simultaneously or alternating with panels of stone ceiling. Sometimes the 13th century examples include mukarnas or other forms derived from contemporaneous Seljuk architecture and reflect the close working relationship of the Masons with their Muslim counterparts. The Gavid at Gegard, added before 1225, shortly after the completion of the main church in 1215, is particularly impressive, with perhaps twice the floor space as the church proper, and the vaults rising above four cylindrical piers, with the central bay covered by a cascade of muqarnas with an oculus at the crown. Now, throughout 13th century Armenia, the Gavid contrasts dramatically with the austerity of the Catholicon. For most Gavids, the exterior surfaces remain plain with carved decoration around the doors or windows, sparsely applied sculptural relief. At Harchevank, the vault is lavish, with the central muqarnas vault similar to that at Gegard, while the exterior is left plain. At Hagpat, the Great Gavid was added to the 10th century Catholicon at the end of the 12th century, expanded around 1209, its vaults delineated by intersecting arches. Within the cupola, a second set of intersecting arches rises to the oculus. The Gavid of the Church of the Holy Apostles at Ani is similarly innovative. Elongated and attached to the south side of the church, the central muqarnas vault is set on the diagonal, raised above two pairs of intersecting arches. The other areas of the ceiling are flat with geometric patterns and two colors of stone. The ruined church of Fonseca in Armenia, at this church, a 13th century drawing was found, thinly etched on the exterior wall of the Gavid, and this seems to have been a preparatory drawing for the construction of the muqarnas vault. This is my colleague Armin Gazarian when we visited the church together a few years ago, and I've highlighted in white the etched lines there, and this seems to be a scale drawing for the preparation of the muqarnas vault. And you see the design continued and the forms of the vault when it was complete. What this indicates is that the design of the elevation was determined during the construction process. This, in fact, is our earliest diagram of this type of vault. With the standardized masonry construction in the Caucasus, it provided all the evidence the masons required to construct the muqarnas vault. Innovative vaulting forms appear in other types of monastic buildings as well, such as in libraries and refectories. The refectory at Hagartsin employs a similarly innovative system of vaulting, repeated twice to span the elongated interior. What's fascinating here is the interchangeability of forms, both within different building types and across confessional boundaries. So where should we situate the remarkable flourishing and originality in the architecture of the Caucasus? Earlier generations of scholars may have sought to view the Caucasus as the origin of Romanesque or Gothic architecture in Western Europe, and indeed, vaulting forms and architectonic articulations are often comparable. Similar attempts have been made to mark the origins of the cross-domed church in the Caucasus rather than in Byzantium. Both claims, I believe, are misdirected and diminish our appreciation of the Caucasus and its architectural achievements. As Meaningful Studies now champions a global approach, it may be best to view the developments in Western Europe, Spain, Italy, Byzantium, the Caucasus, Russia, the Balkans, as well as medieval Islam, as representing parallel achievements of societies at similar points in development, but often with distinct and different concerns coming to the fore. Similarities among buildings widely separated by time and space often might be best attributed to the deep-seated traditions of the Roman past. But as we look at medieval architecture in a global perspective, the differences may be as important as the similarities. Another point is that architectural production is local and reflects locally known practices, materials, and concerns. In most instances, medieval masons did not travel, and it goes without saying that buildings didn't either. Technologies require human beings as vehicles of transmission. The presence of the Armenian architect Turdat in Constantinople in the late 10th century may be a curious exception to this rule, but for the technical knowledge he brought to the reconstruction of the Dome of Hagia Sophia, well, we have to remain grateful. But with the movement of populations and shifting demographics, there's ample evidence for cross-fertilization. For example, the forced or encouraged movement of ethnic populations in the Byzantine period may be impossible to document, although we know there were both Armenians and Georgians in Cappadocia by the 10th century. Alas, there are no inscriptions in either language, only in Greek. But some details are tantalizing. For example, in the 10th century church in the elite residence at Selime, the dedicatory panel is remarkably reminiscent of the panel at Oshvank. The interior of the church at Selime even includes an enigmatic throne niche, like those that appear at Oshvank and other Georgian churches. Could this have been, Selime have been a Georgian residence? I will leave this question open. Now, the centralized plan that we first saw at Hibari is not only repeated in the 7th century, but in a variety of later examples in the Caucasus, notably at Octamar. But it finds its way to Constantinople as well, as, for example, in the 11th century church of the Kamariotissa. How the design came to the Byzantine capital is a matter of debate, but it's important to note that the brick construction and decoration of the Kamariotissa are purely Constantinopolitan. It was built by local masons. Similarly, the domed octagon churches of Greece include many familiar features for which a Caucasian origin is often cited. But in all examples, the construction is local, the details Byzantine, and the differences and distance from the Caucasus is noteworthy. Now, my point is that an architectural idea has traveled in these examples, but perhaps not a mason. The situation is somewhat different when we turn to the innovative vaulting forms that we first saw at Oshvank and which continue into later construction. For example, it's hard to make sense of the Danishmended Divri Mosque and Hospital without a mobile and heterogeneous workforce in the 13th century. Indeed, at least one Georgian artisan is documented at the site. Similarly, scholars have noted workers from the Caucasus at numerous Seljuk caravanserais. The rapid development in the architecture under the Seljuks and Beyliks of the 13th century is hard to imagine without the input of Caucasian masons. And the appearance of the Muqarnas vault in the Armenian Gabits and other monastic buildings emphasizes the interchangeability of architectural forms across confessional boundaries and across functional typologies. It doesn't mean, of course, that the Armenians invented the Muqarnas vault, simply that borders, that is, national, religious, cultural, and ideological borders, were fluid and permeable, particularly in the 13th century. So for me, this is the challenge of the architecture of Georgia and Armenia from the perspective of the global turn in medieval studies. On the one hand, it offers an important corrective to the Byzantine-centered or Western medieval-centered studies, emphasizing both the similarities and differences of cultures in parallel, perhaps with only minimal interchange at times. On the other hand, there are remarkable periods of connectivity. Could we understand the achievements of either 13th century Anatolia or the Caucasus without the movement of workers and technologies? So this is the challenge, to determine when are we looking at societies developing separately and yet in parallel, perhaps reliant on a common past. And when are visual similarities simply the result of stylistic exchange, that is, basically looking and copying? And when is it a matter of technological transfer, relying on human transmission for technical knowledge? So a careful look at the architecture of the Caucasus offers us all three possibilities. That is, a textbook case for how to appreciate the regional within a global medieval perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. That was wonderful. Let's see. Questions. Let me see how we're going to do this. There are so many people here that I'm not going to see your hands necessarily. But let me have a try. Let me look first at chat. If there's something in chat, there are a lot of students who were not my computers. Well. Okay. There is one question, will this talk be available later online? Yes, we will be posting it, both Bilkent and Eret. Let's see, chat has been erased. So I'm going to look for, raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. And
maybe just shout out if you have a question.
Yes, why don't you just shout? That would work, I think, best.
Hello?
Yes, please.
I'm interested in the 7th century, and I was impressed with the volume of construction that took place in the Caucasus in the first part of your lecture. And I was interested because there was a lot of military activity from the time of the Battle of Nineveh in 627, when Heraclius and his Turkish allies won that great victory in the last Romano-Persian War. But I understood that also during this time there was Tbilisi was under siege by the Gutturk, or the predecessors of the Khazar Empire, and I thought there was a lot of military activity during this time. So how does the construction of the churches and the evidence of the prosperity, what can we derive from that in the context of these military engagements during and shortly after the last Romano-Persian War and before the Arab conquest of Armenia later in the 7th century?
Thank you. This is a good question, and maybe one that's impossible to answer. This is one of the surprising elements of in the Caucasus, is that we have a period marked by political disruption, and yet we see this flourishing of architecture at the same time. And it may be simply that the builders are using architecture as an expression of their dominion, their territorial control, or their power. so that we could see these against the backdrop of expressions that, we're here, we're not going away. And beyond that, it's really very hard to say, because if we look at a similar situation in Byzantium in this period, where we're having a great deal of difficulties in the 7th and 8th century, in particular in Byzantium, we don't see this remarkable activity in construction. Where we would see in construction in the Byzantine context would be fortification architecture rather than church architecture. So
Yes,
it is a paradox.
That was my thought exactly, that there is a dearth of architectural achievement, particularly ecclesiastical achievement, in this this disruptive time in the 7th century, and it seems to me and brought out well in the lecture, that the Caucasus stands out as an exception to that.
Yeah, as my colleague Christina Moranci says, there is hardly a dark age in the Caucasus. And it's true that one sees a continuation of architectural production in periods where we really see sort of stagnation in the Byzantine sphere.
Yeah. Thank you.
Here's a question that's come in chat from Fabian Strauss. Whoops, just went by. What is the function of these narrow decorative niches in the outer facades of Armenian and Georgian churches? In the literature, there are quite a few attempts to explain this.
You're talking about the V-shaped niches, I assume. They become very decorative, and they become the areas where we see some remarkable things. In the Cathedral at Ani, for example, the niches have peacock tails in the conchas and things like this. So they become sort of part and parcel of the decorative vocabulary of these buildings. But as I would explain it, their initial function is to relieve the thickness of wall construction. Is where you see them is framing the apses. So if there wasn't the niche, there would be a very, very thick area of wall construction. So this cuts down on the necessary masonry, and it helps in a certain way to express the design of the building or the interior forms on the exterior.
Here's another question, Alessandro Camis. Several of the shown examples dating to the early 13th century show an extensive use of rib vaults in a later time than the over-celebrated Saint-Denis, but also later than some examples in Jerusalem. So the question is, are rib vaults and domes used before the 13th century in Armenia?
Yes. And this is one of those great points of debate that the early scholars looked at these similarities and said, ha, here we have in the Caucasus the predecessors for the great architectural achievements of Western Europe. And we have to look at migrating Aryan artists and so on. And the problem, I think, is that it's one of the basic art historical problems, and that is, as you learn in your first art history classes, that if two things look alike, it doesn't necessarily mean they're related to each other. And the connection may be very, very distant. For me, often I see the connection between sort of the use of ribbed vaults in Western Europe, the use of ribbed vaults in the Caucasus. You also see them in Spanish medieval architecture as well. It's something that ultimately goes back to the Roman tradition. And I think it's something that is picked up and maintained in a variety of ways. These Roman monuments meant something to these different areas that we're talking about, and maybe didn't even mean the same thing, but there was a grandness or monumentality or signative quality to the architecture that was subsequently deemed worth copying. And what we end up with is similar solutions, but never identical solutions in these different areas. When you start picking apart, let's say, a Renaissance and a Georgian basilica, there are any number of differences, whereas very superficially, they might look alike.
Here's a question on the Eastern Caucasus. The question is there evidence of architectural influence on buildings in the Eastern Caucasus? Not specified exactly where that might be, but perhaps east of regions that you talked about.
And the answer is yes. And I have not traveled there. And what I have focused on in my studies of Armenian and Georgian architecture. It's just so great to see David and Armin and the people with whom I traveled through these regions here in our Zoom room today. But I focused on the areas which were sort of critical to the developments at these 3 points in time that I focused on. And these, the focus changes regionally as you see shifts in power and shifts in demographics. For example, we see in the 10th and 11th century the rise of the Tau-Klarjeti region because that's where the power is centered, and this is where we see the innovative architecture. In the 13th century, what we see is a sort of move into the mountains in northern Armenia, and many of these examples of the development of the Gavids with their innovative vaultings, these are in rather isolated monasteries in the mountains that have moved into areas that are more naturally protected. So there seems to be a geographical association with these. And I think there's a larger picture that needs to be developed here. And I know that my Russian colleagues have been looking at monuments in Abkhazia and so on, that we can push this picture of what's going on in the Middle Ages beyond the psychological barriers of national boundaries.
A question here, Andrei Vinogradov. What do you think about the ways of Byzantine Caucasian connections in architecture in some other regions? Syria, northern Mesopotamia, Eastern Asia Minor, Black Sea?
Yes, I think we can extend this picture, but this is also extending our picture of, let's say, what we regard as a center and what we regard as periphery, as we're talking about cultural developments. For example, with Byzantium, we tend to focus on Constantinople, and we get sort of overwhelmed with the idea that everything starts in Constantinople and radiates outward from there. And so it becomes the be-all and end-all of the architectural picture or the cultural picture. And I think if we sort of destabilize this picture and say there wasn't just one center, and what we're looking at are a variety of regional centers that have intersections that are marked by commerce, trade, political alliances, or the absence of political alliances that relate to each other in a variety of interesting ways and are exchanging ideas with each other in a variety of interesting ways. So there are any number of ways we can look at this architecture. There are very distinctive forms, for example, in the Tur Abdin region in southeast Turkey, the Syriac architecture there, that I find really fascinating. There are some similarities with what we see in the Caucasus. I don't know if this means that we have to say Georgian and Armenian builders are working in the Tur Abdin or vice versa. And this is where we need that close analysis of regional architecture to understand what is local or regional versus what is universal. A lot of architectural forms, particularly when we're talking about church architecture, are sort of universal. They're things that you want in a church to define it as a church. And you don't need to go to Armenia to say, oh, we need a dome, or we need an apse, or whatever to make this a proper church. So I think that there are different ways we can look at this. And what I have tried to do in one of my earlier books, Master Builders of Byzantium, also I should point out available in Turkish, is to make a distinction between style and technology. Because there are certain things that you can do in architecture that are simply a result of looking at something you like and say, oh, that looks kind of cool, I want to do that, and imitating it. Some things you can do that way. Many of the people who built neo-Gothic churches in America had never been to France and never seen a real Gothic church in their life, but they knew it was something that they wanted to imitate. But if you're thinking in terms of construction technology, this puts us in a very different kind of discussion, because the transfer of construction technology really depends on people. We're talking about architecture is a field that is, forgive me, architects in the audience for saying this, it's an illiterate field. Ideas are not transferred through writing historically. And so the idea of how you transfer technology really means that there has to be human beings involved in the transmission. So when you see different types of construction in, and make a distinction between them, that will give us more or less the fingerprint of the builders, whereas style we're not. Style can depend on just looking and imitating. Technology really depends on human exchange of ideas. And I try to identify features in architecture that you would only learn by participating in the construction of a building. You couldn't learn them by simply looking at the building once it was finished. And you can understand the style of the building once it's finished, but you can't really understand the way it was constructed unless you're participating in that instruction and you can see, you know, basically the X-ray of the building, what goes on inside the walls, how the walls are built, and so on. So for example, as my friend Armin has pointed out to me, there is a real distinction between construction in Syria, the early Middle Ages, and construction in the Caucasus. While the buildings will look alike, the basic construction technique is different. In Syria, it will be squared stone construction, ashlar construction, whereas in the Caucasus, you will have ashlar facing on the rubble core of the wall. This is very different, but it's not something you would understand just by looking at the exterior of the building. It's something that you would understand by you know, that deep dive into the construction technology.
Let's see, anyone else? Okay, I myself I'm curious about the use of conical roofs on top of domes versus, let's say, round spherical roofs. What is what might explain that?
Um, there is no logical explanation. The conical roof is distinctive visually. And that's something that, I mean, really distinguishes the architecture that we're looking at in the Caucasus. One of the problems with this is that so many churches, I mean, the first thing to go is usually the vaulting. So if a dome had a conical vault, we may never know it because that's the first part of the building to fall. And we see this type of vault in a variety of regional architectures. In Cappadocia, for example, there are churches with conical domes like that. In Constantinople, it's interesting that they were much more concerned with the exterior of the building relating more closely to the interior. So you have, if the dome is hemispherical on the interior, it will be hemispherical on the exterior. And this is something that actually one could go around the Byzantine Empire, the Byzantine sphere of influence, and go sort of region by region and say, oh, this is how they like to do their domes, or this is how they like to do their windows, or what have you, that there are any number of regional variations there. And I don't see any special meaning or technology associated with it. A lot of what I have seen in looking at architecture in places like the Caucasus is we tend to be blinded by modernism. We think, form follows function. We have to come to a liturgical explanation of forms or something like that. And what is missing in that type of explanation is the pure inventiveness of the artisans who were behind the construction. And this is something that I think we really have to think about, is that we can talk about buildings as social constructs, but we also have to talk about them as works of art. How did they come to being? They look like they did, like they do, because somebody wanted them to look that way. That is, there was an aspect of aesthetic judgment that went into their design and their construction.
How unusual is the exuberant decoration at Ogtamar, the exterior decoration?
The decoration at Octamar, which I haven't talked about, but never mind, is really wonderful and has elicited a lot of scholarship and admiration. What we see, I mean, really throughout the Caucasus, is there is an interest in applied sculptural decoration on the exterior that is very different from what we would see in the heartland of Byzantium. It becomes sort of part and parcel of the expression of the church. We saw this in the church at Oshbank, for example, although without the elaboration that we see at Octamar. But there is this love of sculptural variety and sculptural decoration that we see in all periods manifest in different ways. For the exuberance of the sculpture there, I would say Octamar is a standout.
Another question in chat. What do you think about the so-called three church temples in Georgia, which date back to the 6th to 8th centuries, according to Georgian scientists? For example, in Nekresi, how do you date these churches?
For whoever asked that question, I will say, shame on you. As I said at the beginning, I'm really an amateur here, and I would actually turn this question over to my Caucasian colleagues. Perhaps, I don't know, David Costaria would be able to answer it, but I won't. He's shaking his head. Okay, thank you.
Okay. And then another question. Your comment on rubble construction, something derived from Roman tradition for using this in Anatolia in place of concrete? Question mark.
Yes. I have purposely not called it concrete, although it may have concrete-like properties. In the Middle Ages, they often would make concrete, but when they did it inadvertently. They didn't know the Roman recipe. In fact, the Romans really didn't know the Roman recipe. We go back to Vitruvius. To make concrete, you have something he refers to as pit sand, which we know as volcanic sand, which is the active ingredient in concrete or in Portland cement today. And that is what gives it its rock-like hardness and its ability to set underwater. Now, the Romans knew this, and it led to any number of great achievements in Roman architecture, but they never understood the chemical action behind the whole thing. And so if they had sand that was kind of reddish in color, they thought, okay, this must be pit sand, we can use this. And there are examples of aqueduct construction where they thought they were using proper concrete and weren't, because they didn't understand the chemical properties of the materials they were using. In areas that are volcanic, like Cappadocia, for example, you often have an inadvertent creation of concrete. So for example, in my work at Çanakkale, the mortar that they were using to bind the rubble at the core of the walls is using the local volcanic sand in its construction. And as a consequence, they're making a mortar that begins to resemble Roman concrete. And one of the reasons that Çanakkale stood for so long and still stands in large part is because of that very, very strong mortar that they're using there. But they didn't know that they were, approaching concrete in their construction. The standard form of mortar does not have that concrete volcanic component to it. So I refer to it as mortared rubble rather than concrete.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions?
All right, I just hit you over the head with a ton of concrete, so maybe that can bring it to a close.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful, for us, evening, Sunday morning for you and others in America, and so informative and clearly presented a great pleasure to listen to this and to watch you. So thank you, and thank you everyone for tuning in, and have a very nice rest of your weekend.
Thank you, and I hope to see you all in person sometime soon.
Yes, let's hope for that.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Goodbye, everyone. Goodbye.